Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Africa is a Country Talk. I'm Will Shoki, streaming from very, very cold Johannesburg. The weather is absolutely miserable here in South Africa. And my co-host is Sean Jacobs. He's in Brooklyn, New York, where I can see scenes of summer blooming, and I'm very, very jealous. AIAC Talk is a weekly talk and interview show. We broadcast every Tuesday at 7 p.m. East African time, 5 p.m. if you're in Dakar, or 6 p.m. if you are like me in Johannesburg. And our show is produced, as always, by Antoinette Engel, who's in Cape Town, South Africa.
So this is episode 41. I'm amazed that we're still here. On today's show, we want to investigate the politics of Senegal's post-colonial history, especially to grapple with it in the context of the ongoing civil unrest and dissatisfaction with the incumbent president Macky Sall. And today we also want to talk about the present crisis and its long history. So kind of try to not just focus on the present, but see some history there. To suggest perhaps that there's always been a tension between popular uprising and creeping authoritarianism in Senegal, and sometimes from places you wouldn't have thought about if you followed this program. So whether it was Leopold Sedar, Abdoulaye Wade, or Macky Sall, our guests today are Florian, Bobin, and Maram. Florian is a student in African history and the host of the Elimu podcast. His research focuses on post-colonial liberation struggles and state violence from the 1960s and the 1970s in Senegal. And Maram is an associate professor of African and African diaspora literature at East Carolina University, and her work explores gender, verbal art, and migration. And she's also an activist of women's rights in Senegal and its diaspora. And last week, we tackled Africa's long and evolving relationship with Asia. Our guests were Chris Lee, who's a professor of history, Bina Ben Abdallah, who's a political scientist, and Abdurrahim Lema, who is an IR and politics scholar. And that episode is now available on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our Patreon for all the episodes from our archive, and also you can support our work there more generally. But before we get to our guest today, I think Will has some stuff he wants to celebrate.
Well, you know, it's always hard to come by good news these days. It's just bad news abounds literally everywhere. So whenever there's any sort of small piece of good news or something to celebrate, you know, we have to seize it. And in Latin America, they're always the ones who are producing all of the good news. And obviously today, if people have been paying attention to news reports, we're getting the latest from Peru, which is that in the presidential runoff between Pedro Castillo, who is this very kind of ordinary looking high school teacher that is running for president. He's got very socialist beliefs. He wants to transform Peru's economy, which has been governed by an elite which has implemented neoliberal austerity like they have in other parts of the world, is running against this woman, Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who was literally a fascist authoritarian for 10 years and is now in prison for a whole bunch of charges, including corruption and war crimes. She's also had a number of stints in jail for corruption. So Peruvians were making a choice between this man who's promising change, who's sort of framed the polarity in Peruvian society as being between the rich and the poor and the master and the slave, to use his own words, and running against this woman who's, you know, quite literally, you know, a fascist. And at this stage, it's looking like he might win. Of course, one cannot rule out the possibility that if he does win, then Keiko Fujimori and her crew are going to try and do something like stage a coup. A lot of the Peruvian elite is very worried about a possible Castillo victory. There were reports last week that a lot of business people and the extremely wealthy are redirecting a lot of their capital offshore. So there's been massive capital flight at the prospects of his victory. But I think if he does win, it'll be another country in Latin America that is showing how the possibility of a transformative politics is still possible in the world today. And, not so far away in Chile, just as a quick mention, we've mentioned how Chile's been undergoing this process to try and rewrite their constitution. After the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, Chile kept the same constitution that Pinochet put into place. So after massive protests in September 2019, the Pinera government conceded a plebiscite to vote on whether or not the constitution should be changed. A majority of Chileans, over 90%, voted in favor. And in May, elections for the Constituent Assembly, the actual group that's going to rewrite the constitution, took place. And it was a big showing for the left. The center-right and center-left candidates performed really poorly. And the people that have done the best have been the social movements, the grassroots organizations, the communists. So it's looking like whatever constitution is produced from this process is going to be a very thoroughgoing rewriting of Chilean society. So we look forward to that. And, the rest of us need to figure out what we're doing wrong and try and get our act together. And of course, as we talk about these movements for democratization, whether it's electing these candidates that want to unseat the power of the ruling class, and these movements for democratization in Chile, it's as best a context or thing to discuss just before we talk about Senegal and how Senegalese people are trying to democratize their country, which has been facing similar problems. So yeah, let's get going on the episode today. And before we do, I think Sean is on.
No, I'm on mute. Sorry. No, I was just gonna say, this is my problem. I always start badly with the mute. I was just gonna say, I think it's always fascinating that Africans never look to, or don't often make those connections, look to South America, because I think often that's where some of the most interesting politics, which often gets dismissed as populism, because and if you go on Twitter, you have the usual North American debate where they try to make these movements in their own image. So if it doesn't look like the DSA, if it doesn't look like some North American political organization, therefore we cannot support it. So almost by default, they end up kind of endorsing the status quo because they're afraid of what could happen. But as I said, I'm always fascinated.
One thing to say about that very quickly, and it's interesting, exactly as you say that, Africans don't look to Southern America as a point of inspiration. Obviously, that's exaggerating. Some people do, but generally, we often look to the West as our Archimedean point. But what Latin America demonstrates, and we've made this point before, is that how do you bring together a left-wing coalition of not only trade unions and the labor movement, but also social movements rooted in fighting for land rights against mining companies, all of these different struggles that people in the developing world face? How do you bring together peasants?
Identity politics, identity politics. Yeah, these some of the movements I think that are sort of coalescing around Castillo include indigenous rights. So just people about culture, being culturally trampled on in Peru. That the Fujimori government or the various right-wing governments have no time for people's traditions. So how do you figure out how to build those coalitions? Because the left can often be very dismissive of people's traditions and who people are or how people identify. But in any case, we have a good case to talk about today, which is that kind of complicated case. I think I remember one time we had a piece by I'm going to butcher his name, Suleiman Daine,
Bashir Dian,
who's at Columbia, and we had a piece, an interview with him that we published, and it was something about does Islam make sense with Marxism? And he kind of looked at the case of Senegal. So it just so happens that we're talking Senegal today. So we don't want to hold people. We want to get to the program. But before I do that, just a quick shout out again. Remember to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Go to our website, subscribe to our Patreon for all the previous episodes of this series from the archive. And also there you can support our work in general. So to today's program then, as we said, we have two guests. And our first guest is Maram Gay, who is an associate professor of African and African diaspora literatures at East Carolina University. And as I said before, her work explores gender, verbal art, and migration. She's also an activist of women's rights in Senegal and its diaspora. So, Maram, welcome to the program. There you are. Perfect.
Hello.
Great to see you. Just by way of introduction, can you tell us just a little bit about your research? Because we often forget that the reason we bring people on to talk about particular kinds of things, but we never ask them, like, what do you work on? So just by way of introduction, tell us a bit about your research.
Well, I worked on verbal art first, women's wedding songs, and I looked at how women find voice and space through verbal art. So I looked at the wedding songs of the Wolof and how women use it as a space, because African women have always been said to be voiceless. So that was my dissertation, actually, which was broken into several chapters and articles. And then later I worked on hip hop and social change. So I actually wrote a seminal article on Yanama, which has been used a lot in the field. And currently I'm working on a project. It's a book project called Discourses of Wifing. So I'm looking at how terms related to spousal duties have been corrupted due to several factors such as globalization, French colonization, but also a corrupted interpretation of Islam. And on the other end, I'm also the co-founder of a group called Une Sénégalaise aux États-Unis, a Senegalese woman in the US. And we are 3,200 women who are from Senegal living in the US. And that's where I do most of my activism. And I'm also a member of many activist groups in Senegal, mainly feminist groups.
Well, it sounds like you're up to a lot of fascinating research studies. I want to read your, I want to read your work on wedding songs, but I think it's interesting you mentioned you've researched groups like Yene Mar, and we're going to get to them in a moment, as well as all of these other groups that you're active in Senegal at the moment. So maybe for a very broad question, know.
My internet is very spotty, so I didn't hear everything you said.
No worries, no worries. I was about to ask you, could you maybe help us understand what the political environment in Senegal is like right now? These groups like Yene Mar and the ones you're involved with, what political environment are they operating in?
I'm not following them that much these days, but I think that the last time I heard about Yene Mar and what it's doing is during their events around March 4th, when people were protesting and then several people got killed by the police. That was the unrest related to the accusation of rape of a political opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko. But from the perspective of the feminist group where I am active, it seems like women, and I think so many of you have seen it in my Washington Post piece, women's bodies are being used as a political battleground where women are really caught in the middle of a fight between men. Because I think that currently in Senegal, I'm going to be bold and say that women's issues are not taken seriously. So everything is politicized, and that's literally what we talk about among the feminist groups that I am involved in, how to make women's rights visible in Senegal and taken seriously by the government, and women not being used as tokens to serve political ambitions.
Mm-hmm. So one of the figure that a lot of the attention regarding the protests of March, or if you want the dissatisfaction in Senegal, is with Macky Sall, who is the current, I would say since independence, he's the 4th president of Senegal. Mm-hmm. He got elected, it sounds like very recently, he got re-elected in 2019, and the next presidential elections are only scheduled for 2024. But he seems to be very popular. 2019 he got elected, but the next election, right, only in 2024, I'm saying. So, but it seems he's very unpopular. Like it's almost like people can't wait for him to go. Why do you? I mean, how would you just kind of assess his time in power?
I think that Macky Sall, from the perspective of the youth, Macky Sall is a disappointment in the sense that we have to go back to 2012 when he was running against Abdoulaye Wade. And Y'en a marre was really central to Macky Sall being elected because they are the ones who rally people through their art and through their activism to get him elected, literally. Because if we remember properly, Abdoulaye Wade was trying to run for a third term. And the young people behind Y'en a marre rose up and then said, no, enough is enough. And, you know, they have so many songs. There's even a song that's called Enough is Enough. And literally, they are the ones who helped, let's say that in quotation, Macky Sall get in power. And Macky Sall had so many promises to the youth, but then once Macky Sall arrived in power, nothing changed. Actually, things seem to have gotten worse for the young people. Unemployment is really rampant. Education has gone down, literally. Healthcare system, so many problems in Senegal, so that everybody, there's like a disillusionment in among the youth especially, and it seems like everybody wants him to go. And then we have the rise of Ousmane Sonko in the past few years, who run in 2019, and for the first time as a new party that actually was able to have so much support and then even have some representation in parliament. So young people saw in him so much hope. And he rose, I would say, in the heels of what we call the Obama syndrome. And lots of people have so much hope for, you know, what he represents so far.
So it's interesting because you've just described for us how, you know, Y'en a marre was instrumental in getting Macky Sall elected, and now a lot of Senegalese politics and economic program hasn't really changed much. So this time around, when we think of the protests that happened in March, where has Y'en a marre been? What is the perspective of young people? Are they part of the mobilization to put pressure on him, or have they been absent?
Basically, can I just
on Macky Sall?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. So is it that in this case, so before with Y'en a marre and when Macky came to power the first time, they were kind of at the center of it. This protest that happened in March, and I'm asking this, and since then, it sounds like, is Y'en a marre still kind of the major social movement driving them, or do we have now a case in which people are attaching their hopes now to Ousmane Sonko? So
yes,
he's taking
Y'en a marre was in the protest. They were protesting, but this was driven by what we call the Sonkoists, or the patriots. They call themselves the patriots behind Ousmane Sonko. So they were the ones that were actually driving this protest because their leader was arrested on his way to answer to a summons. But Y'en a marre also was in the street because they were thinking that this was Macky Sall's way to orchestrate something against Ousmane Sonko, and they wanted to protect the democracy. So there are so many things, so many layers here at play. And then you have the general frustration against Macky Sall's regime. And then you also have to put it in context of the COVID-19 restrictions and then the impact it has on the economy of the country and even people's mobility, so to say. So if you look at anywhere in the world, protests could be like a way for people to come out of their houses where they have been for so long. And then you have a country that is struggling economically, then of course, people are frustrated, and then this looks like so much that was in the Pandora's box that literally just spilled out.
And I mean, yeah, it's when we think of, you know, Macky Sall as all of this general frustration you've said that built up when he ousted Abdoulaye Wade, right? And he came into power promising to be this massive reformer. He had this thoroughgoing program called the Path to Progress, I think it was referred to. and he wanted to sort of make Senegal an efficient democracy, end social injustice. So these very radical sounding policies. And
Yes.
as we know now, given these protests that have happened, none of this has really come to fruition. So I'm curious in terms of how is he managing that in terms of what he's promised and how little he's been able to deliver. Is there still time for him to deliver on the second term, given that he only was re-elected in 2019? And would his successor possibly do any better?
Well, prior to 2019, he had already done 7 years. So he came in 2012. And first of all, the term was 5 years, and now it's 7 years. And then back to 5 years. So I think that shows literally the promises that were broken. But at the same time, all these promises have not been implemented at the levels where people could see it, so to say. So there is, again, and I don't think that it would be fair to accuse him of creating this kind of elite. There is like the gap between the have and have-nots in Senegal have been widening even before him. Especially during the time of Abdoulaye Wade. Abdoulaye Wade is accused of having created these nouveau riches, these new rich people in Senegal, and also lots of people in have been making so much money through real estate, in the sense that if you have been in Dakar, you see how Dakar is really expensive. It's like Dakar is under construction throughout like this past 20 years. Buildings are mushrooming from everywhere, and you can see the kinds of cars that people drive, and then you see like right across the street such chronic poverty across the street from lavish lifestyles. So it would be unfair to accuse Macky Sall of that, but what Macky Sall has done is widen the gap by not implementing all the promises that he has had, especially when it came to young people. I mean, when we're talking about young people, we're talking about education. If you go to the University of Dakar, which used to be the premier university really in Africa, you could see that there are so many students are having a hard time even getting to have a seat in the classrooms or even go through a whole academic year of studies, or the professors are also unhappy. So there's so much going on. Life is very expensive in Senegal right now. The average Senegalese cannot really afford anything based on the fact that salaries have not increased, but then the cost of living is really, really high. And then Macky Sall has been accused of being a kind of president that doesn't listen to people. He seems to live in his own ivory tower, and then the people are at the bottom. So there is like a big gap between Macky Sall and population, so to say. So all you have to do is go to Facebook and look at his page. Once he posts something, people are so angry that 90% of the messages are insults and call for him to step down.
So just as a kind of related question to that, when you're trying to kind of make sense of the current regime in Senegal, when people say an accusation like, and you see this on the internet, that they are authoritarian, like how? I mean, it's a democracy. Like, what do you say to that kind of characterization of Macky Sall's government? That it's authoritarian.
Well,
do you think that's just wild? That's just a wild throw out thing, or do you think that's like?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think Senegal has been known to be a country where freedom of speech actually existed. But since the arrival of Macky Sall, people have to watch what they're saying. Even now, you say on social media, you see he had imprisoned lots of people who were vocal on social media criticizing him. You have the imprisonment of Guy Marius Sagna. You have the imprisonment of the former mayor of Dakar. You have so many other people, and who actually have been in prison. I mean, whether this is whatever they were accused of is true or not, there is a long list of people who have been jailed because they have criticized Macky Sall in public. So obviously, then that accusation is not 100% false, so to say. And it's because of that when Ousmane Sonko was accused of being of having raped someone, a young woman, everybody thought that Macky Sall was behind him because Ousmane Sonko is his most robust opponent in 2024, and hence he wants to eliminate him the same way that he has eliminated the former mayor of Dakar, who also was running for presidency.
And while we think of whether or not he's authoritarian, something I was kind of surprised to discover actually is that local elections, which were staged to take place in March, were postponed for the third time, I think. And they were originally actually supposed to happen in 2019. So they've been postponed on 3 occasions. So is that significant? I mean, when it comes to Senegal's political system, how important are local elections? Do you anticipate that local elections being postponed repeatedly might become a sort of flashpoint for future conflicts and future unrest, or might it just go under the carpet?
Oh, definitely. And I think that it's not only about Macky Sall, it's also about all the other people around him and people who are trying to also get some kind of clout, who are using local elections to place themselves within strategic positions. So if those elections are postponed over and over and over, people can see that, well, this is leading up to the big election where we're having people trying to manipulate these local elections to get some kind of advantage during the presidential elections. I think that it's obvious that people will react that way. Whether it is being postponed because of COVID or not, it doesn't sound really good because Senegal is still functioning as if COVID doesn't exist. So many other things are happening. So why are we postponing the election and not other things?
So just to before we have 2 other questions. The one question I'm actually curious about is, in order to govern, I understand in Senegal, and you can correct me, that to some level you do need the support of certain kind of traditional forms of authority or religious authority. And I did notice when I went back, just kind of looking at the protests in March, at one point Sonko was talking about Macky Sall wanting to have a 3rd term. And one of the threats he made was to say, if Macky Sall doesn't step down, if Macky Sall really goes through with this thing about a 3rd term, then I'm going to ask the religious authorities to step in and stop this, like stop Macky Sall from getting the term. Can you talk about just a little bit about what is the role of the religious authority or religious authorities or religion, both in, on the one hand, the maintenance of power of the Senegalese state, like the state, or of whoever's in power, whatever party's in power, and at the same time, does it also play a role in protest, in, if you want, kind of questioning power and undermining the regime?
All of you know that Senegal is 93% Muslim. We also have a Christian minority who usually doesn't get involved in politics. But when it comes to the Muslim religious leaders, they do get involved, and especially since in the past, and Senghor had understood that for a long time, when even though he was Christian, he had a really good relationship with the Muslim religious leaders, and many of them actually had pledged allegiance to him in the past during elections. And during Abdou Diouf's time or during Abdoulaye Wade's time, any president who came had to literally placate religious leaders, so to say, so that they can be behind them. And in the past, we've had religious leaders who actually call their followers and say, I want to vote for so-and-so. Like, if you believe in me or believe in my spiritual power, you need to vote for so-and-so. So we have that history in Senegal, but we also have the clout that religious leaders have and the population itself in the terms of authority, so that when the religious leaders ask for peace, people have to comply, so to say. So we've seen that presidents and other officials, political officials, have used that to literally stop strikes, for example, or civil distress by going and calling on the religious leaders to come out and speak. And that's what happened also in March, when religious leaders came literally to break the fight and ask for peace. So there was a truce that happened based on some kind of lobbying by religious leaders who called on Macky Sall to call for the police to stop actually shooting on people and all of that. You also had women who contributed in that way by peacefully marching, but that also was put in the back burner. But religious leaders' role was put at the front because that's how it works in Senegal. I mean, there is there's not only the patriarchy, but also there's a democracy, and then you also have the cloud of religion, which is very heavy in Senegal.
And on that, this idea that religious authority was forefronted and the efforts of ordinary women weren't. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk to Florian right now, and we hope that you stick around for some of that. But when thinking of Senegalese politics, would you say that it's always had this kind of authoritarian undercurrent? So earlier, you spoke of Macky Sall as being this guy who's out of touch. He sits on his ivory tower. And is it the case that it's the political elites, the religious leaders who sit on their ivory towers and are completely out of touch with what the people want and need, and who think that government should happen by their dictation rather than the people expressing their will?
Yeah. I mean, you can see that the young people, not only are they angry because they don't have the prospect of dignified life in Senegal, based on the fact that education is really crumbling down. There's no prospect of employment. You have the migration issue where young people board boats to go to Europe and all of that. So there's a lot of struggle for young people. On top of that, political officials come out and literally insult them. They literally insult them, calling them thugs, calling them people who really have no manners, and also there is this kind of disdain of the people, of the young people. And I think that that is one of the biggest problems in Senegal, where politicians, they promise something, and when they come to power, then not only don't they deliver, but they become really arrogant toward the people who elected them.
Thank you so much, Maram. I mean, this is all fascinating, and we want to connect it with our discussion with Florian. So hopefully you stick around for that. But we want to bring on our final guest right now, who is Florian Bobin. Florian, as we said at the beginning of the program, is a student in African history and the host of the Elimu podcast. His research focuses on post-colonial liberation struggles and state violence from the 1960s and 70s in Senegal. So, Florian, before we hear what you think of a lot of what Maram just said, maybe you could just tell the audience what your research is about.
Yes, so thank you for having me on the show. So my research, as you mentioned, focuses on liberation struggles and state violence in the post-colonial era, if we can call it that way, meaning 1960s, 70s, obviously some of the 1950s, which represents and which is the presidency under the time of Leopold Sedar Senghor. So that's what I focus on. I entered this research through the window of Omar Blondin Diop's story, who really, it's a story that really arose an incredible interest in me, and I realized that there was quite little literature on him, and so I decided to undertake biographical research on him. It's been over 3 years now, and through him, I started researching the story and the history of liberation struggles and state violence.
Sorry I'm still looking at the Blondin image. You've listened to Maram. How do you read we want to go back to Senghor in a minute, but how do you read the current political crises, if you want, or current political developments in Senegal? I mean, what is your sort of, and again, we don't have lots of time, but if you had like 4 or 5 minutes and you could break it down.
Right. Well, I wrote a piece in Africa as a Country a few days after the start of the protests, called "Beware of Martyrs," and I was struck by the intensity of violence in the way that the regime responded to the protests, and to a certain extent, obviously the context has changed, but also to some of the um, the claims and the prospects, the hopes of a youth that feels totally disenfranchised, and there have been two, and this is how Senegal usually is portrayed in the international narrative around Africa being a country, and in this case, Senegal being one of its exceptions linked to democracy. There were two peaceful transfers of power in 2000 between Abdou Diouf, the successor, the heir of Leopold Sedar Senghor, and in 2012 between Abdoulaye Wade and Macky Sall. And so this is usually put forward as, because there was a peaceful transition, it means that there was also a change in power. But in effect, although different powers, Senghor put himself forward as a socialist, Abdou Diouf was the continuation of Senghor's rule through multi-party system, Abdoulaye Wade was a liberal, and Macky Sall, who partook in Maoist movements in the 1980s, is a successor to Abdoulaye Wade, because he was his former prime minister, he was president of the National Assembly and minister of Abdoulaye Wade, and so there's this clear continuation between Senghor and Macky Sall through different contexts. 1980s and the structural adjustment programs went through there. The 2000s as well, and this whole narrative around Africa rising in 2010s. But in effect, in the methods, there's a direct continuation from Senghor's rule. We see it in the way that the regime repressed the protests, the way that the Dakar prefect called to charge the protesters, including the media and everyone. That's what he said. Let's charge everyone. That was caught on tape. Throughout February, before March 3rd, and the big the splash, let's say, that Ousmane Sonko's arrest represented. Every day there would be arrests of political dissidents. Before linked to Ousmane Sonko, or through different movements from civil society, and so we see these methods being perpetuated, a discourse changing, but in effect, there was a let's say a relative democratic opening in the 1980s, but
to ask you,
yeah.
Now I wanna ask you about the 1980s actually, and to ask about Leopold Senghor. I mean, you've written a piece in AIAC before, and the bold deck of that piece, which I think a lot of people would be surprised by, is you say that once you've exhausted all the Negritude quotes, you have to confront the fact that Leopold Sedar Senghor ran Senegal as a repressive one-party state. And I think, we've kind of mythologized Senghor, and a lot of people aren't really attuned to this aspect of his role and leadership. So how would you break that down?
Yeah. So Senghor is mythified, both in Senegal, although that myth is being confronted and is being progressively debunked, but also in a very extreme way, in that Senghor is associated as almost the devil incarnate. But that is also linked to the fact, as I said, that there is this myth that was created around Senghor, because he had moderate positions internationally, because he was a poet. And he was recognized as spearheading the Negritude movement in the 1930s, and championing Black liberation within a French context, calling for equality, which doesn't mean decolonization on the continent, and because he was portrayed as more sensible in the context of other one-party states. But in effect, when you look at his political action beyond his poetry, you see that the progressive Senegalese Union, l'UPS, l'Union Progressiste Sénégalaise, was a one-party state. It repressed opponents. It didn't allow, it dissolved successively all of the dissident political parties, like that of Cheikh Anta Diop, the Front National Sénégalais, the National Senegalese Front, and the Bloc des Masses Sénégalaises, the Senegalese masses bloc, and incorporated those that were opposing Senghor's rule while being a little more moderate towards the end. Used torture as a tool of surveillance in prisons, leading to the deaths of some, like Omar Blondin Diop. Dissolved trade unions and those political movements that were forced into underground. So in effect, if you look at his policy, that is the reality of what would happen. Even in the term of his rule, there's a clear continuation in the 1980s with a different framework of, the neoliberal revolution with the structural adjustment plans. But in 1976, so over 4 years before he stood down, he changed the constitution to allow the prime minister, a position he had revoked by imprisoning Mamadou Dia and his sympathizers that he had then reinstated in 1970. He changed the constitution to allow the prime minister to be the successor to the president in case he were to step down, which he did in 1980.
I just want to clarify something if people are listening and they're wondering if you are making this claim. And I'll say the claim. Was Negritude a way of providing cover for his authoritarianism? So are you making that as part of your claim? I mean, we have other questions, but can you just kind of answer that?
So depends if you're talking about Negritude in the 1930s from Negritude in the 1960s. I don't believe that Negritude in the 1930s was part of a wider scheme of him knowing that he'd come to power 30 years later. He actually, as the expression goes, he fell into politics in the mid-1940s. He was a poet, as of the 1930s. He was a professor of French in France. He was recognized as an artist and as an advocate for Africans' rights in France in the 1930s. If you fast forward to 1960, so 30 years later, Negritude became a state narrative, which now we refer to 1966, for instance, as the great year where the Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres, so the World Festival of Black Arts, took place. Duke Ellington and these extraordinary African and Black diasporic artists came and celebrated Black cultures and African cultures, and that's a reality in 1966. But if you look just a month or two before that festival, that international festival was held, Senghor's regime proceeded to massive repression on political opponents because he didn't want for people coming into his country to witness the fact that Senegal was a repressive state and that Senghor at the head of it was maneuvering that. And so Negritude became the state narrative in the 1960s to cover, yes, Senegal's authoritarianism. And if you just even take a look at Aimé Césaire, who was one of the great Negritude spearheaders as well, when Omar Blondin Diop died in prison in 1973, Aimé Césaire decided to stop having a relationship with Senghor for a few years until, I think, 1876, when Senghor visited Martinique and they made peace. But, and even Léon Gontran Damas, the third prominent artist within the Negritude movement, was very, very critical of Senghor as a head of state.
So it's interesting when we speak about how in the mid-1960s, this campaign of repression of political opponents started to begin. And we mentioned his name earlier, Mamadou Dia. He was one of those political opponents. And the split Senghor had with Dia, do you think that what was really sort of noteworthy about that is that it reflected the two different competing visions the two had for the country? So Dia, on the one hand, he wanted to sort of have a more socialist-minded modern state without the Muslim marabouts, as middlemen between the government and peasants, whereas Senghor wanted to maintain and enhance the connection with the marabouts as intermediaries and to strengthen French interests in Senegal. So could you talk to us about that split that he had with Dia and how it sort of encapsulated different potential post-colonial visions for Senegal?
And can I just add to that? Is there a way in which that split gets reproduced? In other words, does the Senghor vision of how to govern, which is the point I asked Maram earlier about the role of kind of religious authority, that then whoever comes after Senghor, that's the way they govern, because the Dia one was too radical to implement.
Right. I do believe that the split between Senghor and Dia was absolutely decisive in the way that the Senegalese state structured itself and the path that it paved for other presidents and Senghor's authoritarian. So I've got a little noise around. I'm just going to close the window. But yes,
to go back to, we do that on this program where people have to close windows and so on. Realize.
Yeah, well, Maram was talking earlier about how Dakar is under construction. There's excessive construction all the time, so that was part of it. But yes, to go back, I think to understand 1962, we've got to go back at least to 1958, if not before. But let's go back to 1958 just to understand better. Senghor really pulled Mamadou Dia into politics in 1948 when they created their political party. Mamadou Dia was really hesitant to joining politics, but Senghor convinced him to do that. If you fast forward 10 years, in 1958, there's this famous referendum to choose to decide on the fate of African colonies within the French Empire, calling for a community between France on the one hand and its African colonies, which actually paved the way for the French Fifth Republic in a context of the Algerian War for Independence. And so Mamadou Dia and their party, the Progressive Senegalese Union, had decided on a common accord that they would vote no, and that they would decide not to enter this community, which would therefore mean that they would take independence in 1958 instead of what happened 2 years later. In the end, a few months before the vote, after the party had taken a common decision that they would vote no, Senghor decided, after a promise he had made to two members of the French government, namely Michel Debré and Pompidou, Georges Pompidou, who would later become French president and with whom Senghor would have very close ties. He decided that they would not vote for no, and therefore they would allow and they would support the French community. Fast forward a few months later, in the end, Guinea became the same country under Sékou Touré to vote for no, and therefore to obtain its independence in 1958. Mamadou Dia was really upset by that decision because it came as a last-minute warning, and he took that upon himself. Now, 1960, independence is signed because that's how the French Empire and the French state rather implemented its independence through the Accord agreement to transfer powers, which was annexed a whole set of all of these agreements for quote-unquote cooperation, which in effect allowed the French state to have a close eye, if not actually leading, former French colonies, monetary policy through the franc CFA, politics through political advisors, cultural policy through all of these cooperants, as they were called, military strategy as well through very strategic military bases, etc., etc. Educational as well. Until the late 60s, the main university of West Africa, which was the University of Dakar, was still led by a French director, and with most of the professors being French. So all that to say that France already had a hold from the very beginnings of independence, which would in the system that would later be coined as France-Afrique. meaning the neo-colonial apparatus structured around independence, and independence not being the end of the colonial rule, but independence merely being a different stage enabling a neo-colonial status quo. So 1960, Senegal and Mali, then called Sudan, French Sudan, were one of the two only, the two only countries within the French empire in Africa to opt for a federation. They did that. Initially, it was supposed to be with Benin and Burkina Faso, then known as Dahomey and Haute-Volta, Upper Volta. That, with French interference, Ivorian interference as well, the two countries I quoted were decided to split. In the end, it was only Senegal and Mali, and after just a few months, in between Senghor, Modibo Keïta, Mamadou Dia, there were internal dissensions, and they decided to split. That was a second missed opportunity. Now, the third one, which is the one that we referred to, being the arrests of Mamadou Dia and his sympathizers, I would say represented the one of the last opportunities to really seek for liberation from French stronghold in Senegal through Mamadou Dia's policies regarding peasant communities, empowering them through systems of what were called cooperatives, also denouncing French presence, supporting Algeria in its war for independence, and that had ripple effects. It met opposition as well within the French state, as well as within the Senegalese apparatus, especially those who were closer to Senghor. And what we must understand as well is that at the time, Senegal was also one of the only countries that had a system in which you had two heads of states. It was I think in French you say bicephalous system, where you had the head of government and the head of state, and effectively the head of government had more power than the head of state, and that was the case. Mamadou Dia had the effective power. Senghor had the prestige of being president, head of state, but Mamadou Dia actually was the one implementing the policy. And so months and months and months of internal dissensions, of groups of sympathizers of Senghor seeing Dia and his sympathizers as a threat. And we come to the 18th of December, when Mamadou Dia is accused of leading a coup d'etat against Senghor, whose sympathizers had tabled motion of no confidence. And so you have these back and forths regarding the constitution, since the Senegalese Progressive Union is the only recognized political entity who has the final word as the constitution that was that is the mirror of the French Fifth Republic Constitution. Is it the party? Is it the National Assembly? And in the end, Senghor accuses Mamadou Dia and his sympathizers, 4 ministers, of attempting a coup d'etat, while in effect it is more Senghor who I would reckon.
So basically, just like what eventually it plays out as a power play, but the casualty of all of this is actually a certain kind of politics survives.
Right.
I mean, to Will's, I mean, maybe you could just quickly answer that part of Will's question, which is Senghor, and Maram spoke about this too. The division, the way of governing of Senghor then survives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, after 1962, you have Mamadou Dia and his 4 ministers being arrested, sent far to Kédougou, which is a very arid, dry region in the country, in the southeast, neighboring Mali. And as of 1963, Senghor changes the constitution. He erases the position of prime minister, so he effectively becomes the sole person at the head of the state. And as of 1963, he dissolves political parties. He incorporates a few years later one of the main opposition parties that becomes part of the government coalition. And 1963 marks the beginning, really, of hyper-presidentialism based off of the French Fifth Constitution, with Charles de Gaulle being the kind of almost the Republican monarch. And 1963 is the beginning of a very long history of hyper-presidentialism, which Senghor embodies for a time, then Abdou Diouf, Abdoulaye Wade, probably the best, and then now Macky Sall, who's effectively almost eradicated all opposition, at least legally, even though there's a lot of opposition. But yes, 1963 marks that era, and the ousting of Mamadou Dia is something that will be very recurrent later on.
So before we bring back Maram I have one other quick question. Maybe we can quickly do it. So I am curious as to, because this relates to, because we want to talk a little bit about the kind of vibrant tradition of protest that sort of runs concurrently to this way of governing. And the one moment which I know you've written about also, and you've mentioned it before, is the murder of Omar Blondin Diop. I'm probably messing up his name again. But as I understand it, his murder happens on the back of also a bunch of protests that starts, I think, at 68. Like, it's kind of the African version, if you want, of 68. Senegal, I think, Morocco, a couple of other places. And his death is like the end of that vision, of that kind of an alternative vision for Senegal. Can you just say quickly, why was Omar Blondin so dangerous, like politically in Senegal? Because as we know, he never started a movement. He died very young. He's kind of a version of sort of a Senegalese Biko, but there was no movement. Yeah. So can you just kind of what was it that was so dangerous about it that Senghor was like, we got to get rid of this guy? Or let me not personalize Senghor, but if you want the Senghor state.
Right. So as you said, Omar Blondin Diop is part of this 1968 generation that had liberation prospects throughout the world, supporting the anti-war movement in the States against the American war in Vietnam, supporting Palestinian rights, supporting also authoritarian rules throughout Europe and Eastern Europe. And so it was this whole generation that had anti-imperialism, anti-racism, anti-authoritarianism as well as at the heart of the protest. Omar Blondin Diop is kind of this meteor because he died in 1973, as you said. He was only a 26-year-old. He was a student in philosophy. He partook in a few movements linked to the European and then the Senegalese left, inspired by Maoism, situationism. He also was interested in Trotskyism, anarchism. And so he really frequented all of these black circles without really positioning himself truly as within one ideology or another. And so in 1973, he died after being in prison in 1972 because in 1971, so 2 years before his death, two of his brothers and comrades in Dakar were in prison for attempting an attack on Georges Pompidou, who was then president of France, while visiting in Dakar. And Senghor really saw that as an attack almost on him, because attacking Georges Pompidou, who not only was the French president and therefore a close ally, but also a former classmate. They had been classmates in the late 1920s in Paris. That was a personal attack on him. And so Omar Blondin Diop decided to do this whole odyssey, to Syria and then to Algeria to train for military training. He was arrested in Bamako in 1972, extradited to 1971 rather, extradited to Senegal and then imprisoned. And so fast forward to 1973, the repression in prisons, torture was a reality. People were severely affected both physically and mentally. And I don't think that Senghor personally ordered for Omar Blondin Diop to be killed, but it's the reality of torture in prison that killed him, and him endorsing that system, makes him also responsible for that. To go to your question as to why was he so, why he was so dangerous, because it's also a whole generation. 1968 in Dakar almost overthrew Senghor's regime. Senghor called upon French army's support. He was in close correspondence with the French ambassador in Senegal. He also suggested that one of the top military ranked military men in the Senegalese military, that he takes power. And so 1968 and the generation that Omar Blonde Diop was part of represented a threat to his regime, and because he also had this free way of considering politics. Omar Blonde Diop was very had an aversion to authority and to power. I don't think that he would ever have launched a true political career. But Senghor saw him as a threat because most probably he also saw himself through Omar Blonde Diop. They both had classical literary studies in France. They both were critical of the colonial paradigm. Senghor opted for another type of policy when in power, but Omar Blonde Diop did represent that. And final point also, the early 1970s was also a period of really hard repression. If you look back earlier in the year of 1973, you have the assassination of Amilcar Cabral. You talked about Steve Biko also, but there is this major threat of philosophers, of thinkers who are able to put in action their theories, and Omar Blonde Diop was part of them.
I'd like to bring on Maram now, if she's still around, to be part of the conversation again, because it's interesting as we discuss all of this. It almost seems, if you think of the history of Senegal as almost a narrative, there seems to be this kind of tormented dance between, on the one hand, this political elite, which has more often than not this advanced education and then assumes political office and takes on the role of enlightened leadership of the masses. And then you have on the other end, the masses, which, as Florian, you were saying just now, are capable of articulating their demands for change in society. And key in these groups are young people and women. And Maram, you were talking about earlier how the political class in Senegal is so quick to dismiss them. They have this open contempt of young people and women in society. And so there's this history of, in spite of this authoritarian streak that we've identified, which is a continuation into contemporary politics, you have this protest politics by these marginal groups in society. But we don't really hear much of that. And so I'm interested to hear from you, Maram, how you think of this thread of protest politics in Senegal that's being led by young people and women, and how that gets sidelined in our understanding of Senegalese political society.
I think Senegal has a tendency to always laud itself as a place where there is freedom, as a place where there is teranga, there is hospitality, and all of those good things, but it doesn't apply to certain groups, especially women. It still remains a very patriarchal country. It still remains a country where women are put on the sidelines. It still remains a place where they voted a parity law in 2010, but it has yet to be applied the way that it should have been applied. Women continue to be viewed as objects. Women continue to be viewed as less intelligent. Women continue to be viewed as children that needs the patronage of men to do certain things, even though our laws, Senegalese laws, seem to be very progressive. When you look at it on the paper, Senegal has ratified every kind of convention from the United Nations to everywhere when it comes to women's rights. When it comes to implementing it and then putting structures and infrastructure that actually apply that and makes it efficient for women, it's not doing that. As a matter of fact, there is feminicide happening in Senegal throughout. Women are dying every single day. They're finding a woman who's been kidnapped or abducted and then killed. Recently, there was even a Congolese woman who was killed in the streets of Dakar, and there was like a peaceful protest. So, if we look at how Senegal is lauded as a democracy, and then you look at the marginal spaces that women occupy and the young people occupy, there is a big clash in those two worlds. So literally, Senegal is a country of men, Muslim men of a certain age, so to say. The teranga that we are talking about doesn't apply to women, doesn't apply to young people. It's not extended to women. Women extend teranga to everybody else, but they are not the recipients of that teranga.
I have a follow up on this, and I wanna sort of connect it to the way France plays a role looming in the background against us. So if Senegal is a patriarchal society, if you identified Maram, when we think of France's colonial model, it was a patriarchal model insofar as France was this patriarch and its colonial subjects were these children that it had to civilize in the ways of modernity. So this sort of persistence of patriarchy, not only patriarchy as understood of this idea of dominance by men of women, but this idea that Senegal is a society that really belongs to these big men, these philosopher kings who exist to sort of govern on behalf.
But also the way in which it sounds like it's also the way in which, following Florian, the way in which Senegal basically copies kind of the way that France governs itself. Like, oh, we're going to have a certain form of presidency. If so Senghor is like the goal, or like you said, in France, they have that idea of the prime minister and the president, and the different kind of, Jospin. I'm trying to remember that time, like in the 90s and the 80s, I was reading the newspaper and I'm like, hold up, who's this guy who's the prime minister with some of this power? And you sort of what you're kind of describing is Senghor ran into the problem with that and was like, oh, I'm going to try to be the goal. So there's definitely like to Will's point, there's a way in which what Senegal is doing is not entirely, it's mystical and it's homegrown and it's traditional. At some level, it's also it's implicated in a kind of larger imperial project.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the protests, right, were also against. I understand a lot of the protests now in March was also against French businesses.
Yeah. I think when it comes to especially to women, and I'll go back to the French literally infantilizing of its former African colonies, literally, where they actually are children that mimic their fathers, whatever their fathers do, they have to do. When it comes to women, we see how this ties to the coloniality of power, the coloniality of gender, and how the way that Senegal and many of the former French colonies treat their women is really a mirror image of how of French patriarchy. But at the same time, in the case of Senegal, it is also Islamic patriarchy, or a perception of Islamic patriarchy, and a perception of a certain African patriarchy. Because usually we are said, well, we're told this is what used to happen in our communities, but that is not true, because these communities have actually been through French colonization, they've been through Arab colonization through Islam, to the point that what we are is an amalgamation of so many things. And then women are caught in the middle when we are told that this is how women used to be, but that's not true. When we look at African cultures, this is not how women were treated. So you see how Senegal treats its women, it is really the same way that French has treated its women, and also the same way that French has treated its colonies in Africa. So there is this paternalism that we see when it comes to the relationship between France and Senegal, where Senegal copies everything that France does, and then wants to apply the same paternalism on women when it comes to women's freedoms, women's right to have voice, or to be treated as citizens of the country, because they sit at the margins, the same way that the young people also sit at the margin when it comes to main decisions.
Florian, do you want to add anything?
Yes. So if you take a historical point of view regarding the marginalization and the silencing of women in political struggles, it's also the case in liberation struggles from the 1960s, even 50s up to the 1970s, which is the era I study. We're talking about state violence. I first got into this period through liberation struggles, and so we could talk a lot more about the ways that Senegalese youth organize themselves, and not just put the focus on the way that they were repressed. Because I think that if we only put forward the way that Senghor's regime tried to silence the youth, then it doesn't do justice to also the aspiration of freedom, and also the ingenuity in which these movements also structured themselves amid a very hard political context. But within these struggles, there are also very many women, and they are not recognized as much as they should be. Whether it's in the Parti Africain d'Indépendance, le PAI, so the Independence African Party, figures like Awa Gaye, Chumbe Som, Caroline Faye Diop. Then later in more leftist-leaning revolutionary youth-led movements, Marianne Dem from the Front Culturel Sénégalais, Rokhaya Dabafal, Mariétou Dioum Diop. Like, you have this long list of very many active women, Eugénie Rokhaya Aw as well. But they're not put forward, they're not recognized. And I think that there's also, in historical research and historical transmission, also this necessity to understand that liberation struggles and revolution cannot just be equated to masculinity, and to this idea that revolution can only be undertaken by men, because historically it hasn't been the case, and it still isn't today. So I think that's important to also acknowledge.
I have one other question then, which is makes those linkages between France and Senegal, and those linkages about maybe other kinds of movements that can push things a little further. Florian, you've written about this movement called Faidherbe must fall, or I don't know how you say his name. He was a French colonial general, and there's a movement to remove statues that was in his honor. Is that a movement that is so? If you look at those must fall movements in South Africa, in the UK, in the US, with Black Lives Matter and so on, many of these movements, they make those connections between imperialism, patriarchy, especially patriarchy, gender, sexuality, and capitalist oppression. Is something like Faidherbe, does it point to something like that? Like in its connection, making the connections with France, making the connections around imperialism, colonialism, etc. But does it also make these other kinds of connections around the position of women and the position of young people? You can answer this.
No, I wouldn't be able. I couldn't confirm that, to be honest. I know that Faidherbe must fall, Faidherbe doit tomber, which was a campaign that's been launched for several years now. We can make connections between that movement and revolutionary movements like that. Maram talked earlier about Guy Marius Sagna, who's at the head of a movement called FRAP. So it's a movement for a Pan-African anti-imperialist and popular revolution. They're members of that movement that are also part of this Faidherbe must fall movement. And so we see clear connection between wanting to regain one's sovereignty and wanting to deboot anti-imperialist interests, and how figures such as Faidherbe represent that. Because Faidherbe was one of the main colonialists who was at the head of a colonial enterprise that killed thousands of Senegalese people. He massively set fire to villages, and he instaured this rule of terror. And so, still recognizing that he is a person that deserves to be put forward in the public space, is for many people very an insult to one's sovereignty. And beyond Faidherbe must fall, there's also a campaign which members of the FRAP movement had partaken in, which was to protest against a central place on Gorée Island, which was a central component of the European slave trade that honored Europe through the name of the Europe Place Square, which was later renamed. So, there's this whole movement to regain sovereignty against imperialist interests that aim at getting rid of these symbols of imperialism. However, I'm not able to really connect them necessarily to feminist struggles or to wider issues. Maybe, but I can't confirm that.
So I know we want to conclude, but you mentioned this organization, FRAP, and I'd like to hear from both of you. When we think of Senegal and the fact that the political crisis is going to keep continuing, and we've problematized Ousmane Sonko and the Sonkoists, and we've spoken about Yene Ma, we've spoken about M23. In the future, if you were holding a crystal ball, that movement which tries to connect all of these issues and mounts a serious challenge to the political class in Senegal, where do you think it's going to come from?
God, that's a difficult question. I'm going to speak from a pro-feminist perspective. I think that until Senegal recognizes the role that women can play in not only political leadership, but in terms of designing the trajectory of the country, being involved at all levels, I think we're going to have, these things are going to continue. I'm saying this because I don't know how many of you are following the Senegalese media sphere, especially on social media. You see that women are doing so many great things, but not being recognized. And there is no backing away or going back to women sitting on the sidelines. They're going to take what is theirs, whether people like it or not. So you see that if you follow, for example, feminist activists on social media, you see that they are being attacked left and right and being denied the right to speak, not only by just regular people on social media, but also even when they start to occupy the national media, there is a harsh backlash. So until women are given the spaces to say what they have to say, but also given responsibilities and given the opportunities to apply for certain jobs, to be in political leadership, I think we're still going to see these kind of issues, because you cannot run a country by stifling the voices of 51% of the population, which is the number for Senegal in terms of women.
And Florian?
Yeah, well, to extend that, obviously, putting as a central core component of decision-taking and everyday life is respecting women's rights. As an extension to that, I think that it's important also for movements, whether they be in the political arena or not, and FRAP among others are doing this, to massify and to speak more to people who don't necessarily speak French, who are not necessarily interested because they've been disenfranchised for so long, namely the youth, and I think that there's a lot to to continue to do on that level. Also, one core component is showing the example at the top, and right now, whether it be it corruption, whether it be it political decisions that are not taken in the interest of the Senegalese people. When example is not given at the top, many people are like, well, what to do now? If what is seen at the top is politicians going from one party to another, is presidents being accompanied with 40 cars in their motorcades for a simple visit within a province, when it's these financial scandals such as that of Petrotim a few years ago, where you have the president's brother who's involved in this multi-billion case linking a company dealing with oil and BP, British Petroleum. When examples not given at the top, obviously, and people are disenfranchised, there's a disinterest in politics, and also when the majority is kept into precarity and into poverty, into mass poverty, unemployment, lack of prospects after you leave university and school, it's very difficult to see a way out of there. And finally, there's also a necessity, I think, and this many people talk about, to rethink structures. This goes beyond Senegal, but as of the 1960s, when the political borders stayed intact, those that were drawn, if we want to say it broadly, at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, when these French interests and foreign interests, and it's not just France, but obviously France has a massive stronghold over all sectors of the economy and more broadly on politics, on culture. It's a whole framework that's, I think, to be rethought rather, and starting with the way that the state works, how the position of president gives almost immunity and allows for people to continue their actions being unpunished. 13 people were killed in the protests in March, and there's no one has been heard. No one has been has gotten any sentence for that. And so there's a broader reflection around the Fidel Masfo campaign, around all of these symbols and the praxis of imperialist structures that continue to play in the way that the Senegalese state works, and therefore in the way that the nation also exists.
I think it's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Will.
No, go ahead, because I was gonna connect it to closing out the show, but
No, before you close out, I just thought, I think to go back to something you said at the beginning of the show, when you celebrated the events in Peru, and especially in Chile, I think what's fascinating about Chile is a very socially conservative society. It was governed by, for a long period, right, by an authoritarian form of regime. It came up post that period with a kind of very watered down constitution. But now, to go to Maram's point about sort of new kind of feminist politics, in the last elections now, the mayor of Santiago is a feminist communist. This is in a very conservative society. The regional governor of that region is also a feminist who got elected. And for the new constitution that they're drafting, there is parity in the representation of women equal to that of men on that drafting body. So, again, to Will's point earlier at the beginning of the show, and this would be a nice way to end it before Will speaks, is I think it really shows us again, maybe we should be looking over there. We should be looking, as Florian's point, look away from France if we want to rethink these models, not just in Senegal, but I think we should be looking way more and more to South America for these kind of bold experiments and not be afraid that they're going to fail, because I think this is the problem. Look at South America and what they're up against. And if they don't live up to it in a perfect way to what people are doing and watching it from the north, then we think it's failed. But that doesn't say we can't try. And I feel like South America shows us that you can invent new kind of politics, especially radical feminist politics in this case.
I think Cape Verde is also trying to do that in West Africa.
We look at Cape Verde. Yeah, we didn't even get it.
I think we look at Rwanda too. I mean, we have lots of models, I think.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten into diasporas, the role of the diaspora. I think in Senegal, the diaspora can vote, right? And have representation. Yes. I'd be curious as to what kind of role they play in imagining a new kind of political system that is not this one that, keeps perpetuating certain kinds of power. I would be curious, especially since you're in...
I think Ousmane Sonko has a big following in the diaspora. I think lots of diaspora people are backing Ousmane Sonko. So it would be interesting to see. The diaspora does play a big clout in Senegal, especially economically. So I wonder now how that's going to translate to political power. It would be interesting to see. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting. We think of Chile constitution writing from where I am, South Africa, which had a very similar kind of thorough, comprehensive constitution writing process in the 90s, but still beset by many of the problems that Senegal is also beset by. All of these other issues of needing to massify, needing to be rooted in popular struggle still sort of permeate. But I think there's so much to say, and we'll do our best to try and sort of exhibit a lot of the resources that you're referring to, so people can keep informed about what's happening in Senegal. But until then, absolutely agree with Florian that we need to rethink colonially imposed boundaries. It's time for Africa to finally be a country. But until then, stay watching
Africa's what happens. I want credit for that. I want credit when finally that was my.
You definitely will.
That was my gift to the world.
You definitely should get credit for that. You should get credit for that.
When that happens, Sean will take credit. But until then,
finally, I will get some credit for something. It will be like a moment. Oh my God, I've never had credit for something, and this will be my moment.
Hopefully, in our lifetimes.
That will be my negritude. That will be my negritude. That will be my negritude. But thank you so much for watching. From me, William Shoki, to my co-host Sean Jacobs, who will hopefully one day have his moment, to our wonderful guests Maram and Florian, Bobin, and as always, our excellent producer Antoinette Engel. A reminder: if you enjoy our work, if you enjoy what we're doing, please hit the like and subscribe button. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, as well as Instagram, and we'll keep bringing you more excellent minds from the continent, so that we can hear more about why Africa should be a country. But until then, goodbye.